On a cold morning in Montana, Mark Thompson, a wildlife photographer, stumbles upon an unbelievable sight. A mother bear and her 3 cubs are chained to the railroad tracks, with a train barreling toward them. How could a bear be chained in such a dangerous position? And will Mark be able to save them in time? What happens next as secrets begin to unravel will leave you speechless. Stay tuned to find out. Before continuing the story, tell me which city you're watching from. I want to know how far this video has come. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so I can send you exciting stories like this every day. Mark Thompson lowered his camera, his hands trembling in the biting February air. What should have been another peaceful morning, capturing the sunrise over the Bitterroot Mountains, had turned into a nightmare. Through his telephoto lens, he'd spotted something impossible: a mother grizzly and her cubs chained to the railroad tracks, their desperate growls carrying on the wind. "Dear God," he whispered, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air. The mother bear's once powerful frame showed signs of abuse, her thick brown fur matted with blood and grime. Her cubs, no more than a few months old, huddled against her, too young to understand their fate, but old enough to feel their mother's fear. The train whistle blared again, closer now. Mark's heart pounded as he scrambled down the steep embankment, his boots slipping on patches of ice. 20 years as a wildlife photographer had taught him to keep his distance from bears, especially mothers with cubs. But there was no choice now. Someone had done this deliberately. The heavy chains wrapped around the mother's neck and body were proof enough. "Hold on," he called out, though he knew the bears couldn't understand. The mother bear's eyes locked onto him, and in them he saw something that made his chest tighten. Not aggression or fear, but a desperate plea. It reminded him of another pair of eyes, his son Ethan's. The night his wife Sarah died 3 years ago. That same look of helplessness, of needing someone to make things right. The ground trembled beneath his feet as he reached the tracks. The mother bear watched him, her massive body tense but not aggressive. Up close, the cruelty was even more apparent. The chains were old logging chains, deliberately wrapped to prevent escape. The cubs whimpered, pressing closer to their mother. Mark pulled out his multi-tool, his fingers numb as he worked at the first lock. The train's headlight appeared around the bend, its beam cutting through the morning mist. His hands shook as he struggled with the stubborn metal. Come on," he muttered through gritted teeth. The mother bear suddenly shifted, and Mark stumbled backward, expecting an attack. Instead, she stretched her neck forward, making the chains more accessible. Their eyes met again, and in that moment, Mark felt a connection he couldn't explain. 2 parents who would do anything to protect their young. The lock finally gave way with a sharp click. Mark moved to the next one, his movements frantic now. The train's horn blasted, deafening at this distance. The engineer must have spotted them, but on these mountain tracks, stopping quickly wasn't possible. The second lock broke free. The mother bear shook violently, trying to help loosen the chains. Her cubs cried out, their small bodies trembling. Mark could feel the heat of the train's approach, hear the screech of brakes being applied too late. With a final, desperate heave, the chains fell away. The mother bear lunged forward, snatching one cub in her mouth. Mark didn't think. He grabbed the other 2, ignoring every instinct screaming at him to run the other way. Together, they dove down the embankment as the train thundered past. So close he could feel the rush of air on his back. They tumbled through snow and brush before landing in a heap at the bottom. For a moment, Mark lay there, heart racing, ears ringing. Then he felt movement, the cubs squirming in his arms, alive and unharmed. A few feet away, the mother bear rose shakily, her own cubs safe in her grasp. Mark slowly set the cubs down, expecting the mother to charge him, but she didn't. She waited as her cubs bounded to her, checking each one with gentle nudges. Then she turned to Mark, and he swore he saw gratitude in her dark eyes before she led her family into the forest shelter. Sitting in the snow, watching them disappear, Mark felt rage building inside him. Someone in their small mountain community had done this, had looked at these magnificent creatures and seen only objects for their cruelty. He pulled out his phone with shaking hands, first to call the wildlife authorities, then to dial a number he'd been avoiding for days. "Ethan," he said when his son answered. "Son, I need your help. There's something happening out here. Something wrong. And I think it's connected to those new friends of yours." The silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes, and Mark knew his instincts were right. The sick feeling in his stomach grew as he realized this morning's rescue wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. The forest held its breath as Mark climbed back up to the railroad tracks, his muscles aching from the morning's desperate rescue. But there was no time to rest. Those bears needed help. The mother's injuries, visible even in the chaos of their escape, told a story of prolonged abuse. The thought made his hands clench into fists. His son's silence on the phone still echoed in his mind. Ethan had finally mumbled something about coming over after school, but Mark had heard the fear in his voice. Whatever dark secret lurked behind this morning's horror, his son knew something about it. Mark followed the bear's tracks through the snow, grateful for his years of wildlife photography experience. The mother was moving slowly, clearly struggling. Her cubs, smaller prints, showed them staying close their path, weaving through the dense underbrush of the Montana wilderness. The trail led toward the creek that ran through his property, a blessing in disguise. 3 years ago, after Sarah's death, Mark had transformed their sprawling 10 acres into an unofficial wildlife sanctuary. What had started as a way to escape his grief had grown into something meaningful, a place where injured animals could heal before returning to the wild. "Come on, girl," he murmured, spotting fresh blood drops in the snow. "Just a little further. I can help you. The bears have found shelter in a shallow cave near the creek's edge." Mark approached carefully, making soft sounds to announce his presence. The mother bear's eyes gleamed from the shadows, alert but not aggressive. Her cubs huddled behind her, their small faces peeking out curiosity. "Easy there," Mark said softly, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. He could see her wounds better now. Deep gashes were the chains that cut into her flesh. Older scars telling a story of previous abuse. Someone had held her captive for weeks, maybe months. The thought made him sick. The bear watched as he slowly set down his backpack and withdrew a tranquilizer gun, standard equipment for his sanctuary work. He had a permit and training to use it, though he rarely needed to. "I'm sorry," he whispered, taking aim, "but it's the only way I can help you." The dart found its mark. The mother bear let out a low moan but didn't charge. Instead, she turned to her cubs, gently nudging them deeper into the cave before her legs began to wobble. She laid down gracefully, her eyes never leaving Mark as a sedative took effect. Mark waited until he was sure she was unconscious before approaching. The cubs whimpered but stayed close to their mother, too young and scared to run. He worked quickly, cleaning her wounds with supplies from his pack. The injuries were worse than he'd feared. Infection had set in around the deepest cuts. His phone buzzed, a text from Ethan. "Dad, I'm coming over now, not waiting for school to end. There's something you need to know." Mark's stomach tightened. Part of him wanted to demand answers immediately, but experience had taught him that pushing too hard would only make Ethan retreat further, like working with injured wildlife. Some things couldn't be rushed. He focused on the task at hand, carefully applying antibiotic ointment to the bear's wounds. The cubs had grown bolder, occasionally sniffing at his hands before darting back to safety. They were thin but not starving. Someone had been feeding them, keeping them alive for God knows what purpose. The sound of tires on gravel made Mark look up through the trees. He could see his truck approaching. Ethan must have walked to the house and gotten the keys. Smart kid. They'd need the truck's winch to move the sedated bear. Ethan emerged from the truck, his teenage frame hunched against the cold. His face went pale when he saw the bears. "Dad, he started, then stopped, swallowing hard. "Help me first," Mark said firmly. Questions later, together, they worked to secure the mother bear on a tarp, using the winch to carefully load her into the truck bed. The cubs, surprisingly, followed willingly, staying close to their mother. Mark couldn't help but notice how Ethan's hands shook as he worked, how he couldn't quite look at the bear's injuries. "It was Jake's idea," Ethan finally said as they drove slowly back to the sanctuary. His voice was barely a whisper. "He said he found them near his uncle's hunting cabin, so we could train them, make money showing them off like a circus." Mark gripped the steering wheel tighter, but kept his voice steady. We'll talk about it at home right now. These bears need our help. The sanctuary's treatment barn was ready. Mark had called ahead to his assistant Maria, who had prepared the largest enclosure as they unloaded the bears. Ethan spoke again, his words tumbling out. We didn't mean for it to go this far. Jake said his uncle would help, that he knew how to handle bears. But then things got bad, and when the mother bears stopped cooperating, they decided to kill them. Mark finished the morning scene replaying in his mind, chain them to the tracks and make it look like an accident. Ethan nodded, tears streaming down his face. I tried to stop them, Dad, last night when they said what they were going to do. But Jake and his uncle, they've got something on me, something Mom wouldn't want you to know about. Mark paused in his work, really looking at his son for the first time in months. He saw not the angry teenager who'd been slipping away, but the scared boy who'd lost his mother too young. Whatever secret Ethan carried, it couldn't be worse than what almost happened this morning. We'll figure it out, Mark said, pulling his son into a rough hug. But first, we need to get the authorities involved. What Jake and his uncle did, it's not just cruel, it's criminal. As if understanding their conversation, the mother bear stirred slightly in her sedated state. One of her cubs had curled up against her neck, while the others explored their new enclosure under Maria's watchful eye. Looking at them, Mark felt a fierce determination. These bears had been given a second chance at life. Maybe this was his and Ethan's second chance too. But first, they had to make things right. And that meant facing the darkness that had led to this moment, no matter how ugly the truth might be. The morning sun filtered through the treatment barn's windows, casting warm patches of light across the recovering bears. Mark watched as the mother bear, whom they'd started calling Grace, gently nuzzled her cubs, her movements still careful around her healing wounds. The antibiotics were working, fighting back the infection that had threatened her life just days ago. Ethan stood beside him, shoulders tense as they waited for the police to arrive. They'd spent the past 2 days gathering evidence. Photographs of the chains, GPS coordinates of the tracks, documentation of Grace's injuries. But the hardest part was still to come. Ethan would have to tell a story. What if they don't believe me? Ethan whispered, his voice cracking Jake's uncle. He's friends with people in town. And the things I did. Mark placed a hand on his shoulder, feeling the slight tremor running through him. The truth matters, son. Whatever happened, whatever you did, we'll face it together. The crunch of tires on gravel announced the arrival of Sheriff Olivia Martinez, a no-nonsense woman Mark had known for years. She stepped out of her patrol car, followed by a wildlife crimes investigator from the state agency. Luna lifted her head at the new voices, positioning herself between her cubs and the barn entrance, even injured. Her protective instincts never wavered. Mark understood that instinct all too well. Hadn't he felt the same way since Sarah's death, trying to shield Ethan from every hurt? Mr. Thompson, Sheriff Martinez, nodded as she entered. Her eyes widened slightly at the sight of the bears, but she maintained her professional composure. Walk me through what happened. As Mark recounted the rescue, the wildlife investigator examined Grace and her cubs from a safe distance, photographing their injuries and taking notes. Ethan stood silently, his face growing paler with each detail. And you believe Jake Durham and his uncle Robert are responsible? The sheriff asked, her pen poised over her notepad. Before Mark could answer, Ethan stepped forward. I know they are, he said, his voice stronger than Mark expected, because I was there at the beginning. Over the next hour, Ethan's story spilled out how Jake had found the bears hibernating near his uncle's cabin, how he convinced Ethan and 2 other teens, Emma and Ryan Martinez, the sheriff's own nephew, to help him capture them. They'd used tranquilizers stolen from Robert Durham's veterinary supplies. Jake said we could train them, make money from tourists. Ethan explained, his words coming faster now. His uncle had done it before. He said, had connections with private collectors, roadside zoos. But Grace, she wouldn't cooperate. She was too protective of her cubs. The sheriff's face hardened at each revelation, especially at the mention of her nephew and the decision to chain them to the tracks. Ethan's voice dropped to a whisper. That was 2 nights ago. Jake said Grace had become too dangerous. His uncle agreed, said they needed to dispose of the problem. I tried to stop them, but he pulled out his phone, showing them texts from Jake threatening to reveal something. Jake knew about the night Mom died, Ethan said, looking at his father about what really happened at the hospital. Mark felt his heart stop. The night Sarah died had been a blur of grief, but he remembered Ethan disappearing for hours. When he returned, something had changed and Mark had been too lost his own pain to push for answers. "What happened that night, son?" Ethan's eyes filled with tears. "I was so angry at everything. I broke into the hospital pharmacy, stole some pills. Jake caught me, helped me cover it up. He's been holding it over me ever since. The sheriff exchange looks with the wildlife investigator that gives us enough for a warrant," she said, standing. "We'll need formal statements from both of you." As they walked out, Mark pulled Ethan close. This time his son didn't pull away. They stood together, watching Grace with her cubs, a family healing, despite everything they'd endured. Maria approached quietly, her arms full of fresh bedding for the bears. "Luna ate well this morning," she reported. "And look at this." She nodded toward the cubs who had started playing with some enrichment toys they provided, rolling logs, hiding treats inside them, their natural curiosity overcoming their fear. "They're learning to trust again," Mark said softly. "So are we, Dad," Ethan replied. And for the first time in 3 years, Mark saw a glimmer of his old son in those eyes. A commotion outside drew their attention through the barn windows. They could see 2 more police cars arriving. Jake Durham was in the back of one, his face twisted with anger. His uncle Robert was being led out of the other in handcuffs, his veterinary reputation in tatters. But it was a third car that made Ethan tense. Emma and Ryan stepped out, both looking as haunted as Ethan had. Their parents stood behind them, faces etched with disappointment and concern. "They need to see this," Ethan said suddenly. "They need to see what we almost did and what we can do to make it right." Mark watched as his son walked out to meet his former friends, his steps steady despite his fear through the barn door. He could hear Ethan's voice, strong and clear. "Come meet Grace. She has something to teach us about forgiveness." Inside the barn, Luna lifted her head again, watching the approaching teenagers with cautious eyes. But there was something else in her gaze, to something that mirrored the growing light in Ethan's eyes. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was a beginning. And sometimes Mark thought watching his son lead his friends toward redemption. That's all anyone needs, bear or human, to find their way back to what matters most. Mark watched from the barn doorway as Ethan led Emma and Ryan toward Grace's enclosure. The 3 teenagers moved hesitantly, their faces a mix of fear and shame. Behind them, their parents hung back, giving them space for what needed to happen. Luna had risen to her full height, her massive frame blocking access to her cubs. Despite her healing wounds, she remained an impressive sight, a reminder of the untamed power and beauty. Her dark eyes studied the approaching teens with an intelligence that made Mark catch his breath. "We did this," Emma whispered, her hand covering her mouth as she took in Grace's bandaged injuries. The usually confident daughter of the town's most prominent doctor seemed to shrink under the bear's steady gaze. "We actually did this." Ryan, the sheriff's nephew, couldn't even look directly at Grace. His shoulders shook as he spoke. Jake said it would be like a game, just something to make money. But this, he gestured at the scarred bear. "This isn't a game. This is evil." Ethan stepped closer to the enclosure, his voice steady despite his trembling hands. "That's why we have to make it right. All of us." He turned to face his former friends. "No more secrets. No more letting Jake control us with fear." The mention of Jake's name made them all flinch. Their former ringleader was now in juvenile detention, along with his uncle Robert, whose veterinary license had been permanently revoked. The investigation had revealed a history of wildlife trafficking that stretched back years. "I don't even know where to start," Emma admitted, tears streaming down her face. "How do you make up for something like this?" "You start by telling the truth," Sheriff Martinez said, stepping forward. Her face was stern but not unkind as she looked at her nephew. "All of it, even the parts that hurt." Over the next hour, the full story emerged. Jake had found Grace and her cubs during a hunting trip with his uncle. Instead of reporting them to wildlife authorities, he'd seen an opportunity. He'd gathered his friends, the lonely new kid grieving his mother, the perfectionist doctor's daughter cracking under pressure, and the sheriff's nephew desperate to prove himself. "He knew exactly how to manipulate us," Ryan said bitterly. "He knew I was dealing drugs at school, that Emma was cheating on tests to keep her grades perfect. He promised to keep our secrets if we helped him." Mark noticed how Ethan reached out to steady Emma when she swayed, how Ryan moved closer to support them both. The same bonds Jake had twisted to enable cruelty were now strengthening in its rejection. Luna watched it all, her cubs now peering curiously around her legs. One of them, the smallest, who made named Hope, actually took a few steps toward the teens before retreating. The gesture wasn't lost on anyone. "Look at them," Ethan said softly. "After everything we did, they're still willing to try to trust again." Dr. Chun, Emma's father, spoke for the first time. "The question is, what are you willing to do to earn that trust?" The three teenagers exchanged looks. It was Ryan who answered first. "Whatever it takes. We'll testify against Jake and his uncle. Take whatever punishment we deserve." He looked at his aunt, the sheriff, with tears in his eyes. "I'm done hiding who I am." Emma nodded, straightening her shoulders. "I want to help here at the sanctuary, learn about the animals we hurt, teach others to protect them instead." "Won't be easy," Mark warned, caring for injured wildlife, earning back the community's trust. "It's hard work." "We know," Ethan said, and Mark heard the new strength in his son's voice. "But we owe it to Grace, to ourselves." As of understanding her name, Grace let out a soft chuff. Her cubs, growing bolder, began playing near the front of the enclosure. The smallest gestures of normal behavior were precious signs of healing. Sheriff Martinez cleared her throat. "There will be consequences. The Wildlife Crimes Unit is pressing charges, and the juvenile court will want to see real change." But Dr. Chen added, "If you're serious about making amends, about becoming the people we know you can be, you'll have our support." Mark watched as relief washed over the teens' faces. They'd been carrying their guilt like stones, and while the weight wasn't gone, it was now shared, manageable. Maria approached with the evening feeding cart. "Why don't you help me prepare their dinner?" she suggested. "It's a good place to start." As the teams followed Maria, learning the proper protocols for feeding the bears, Mark stepped outside. The spring air was growing warmer, carrying the scent of new growth. Sheriff Martinez joined him, both of them watching through the window as their children took their first steps toward redemption. "They'll be okay," she said, though it sounded more like a question than a statement. Mark thought of Grace, of how she looked into his eyes that morning on the tracks, how she'd chosen trust over fear, even in her darkest moment. "Yes," he said firmly, "they will be. Sometimes the worst mistakes lead us to the best parts of ourselves." Inside the barn, he could hear laughter mixing with the sounds of curious cubs. It was a forgiveness, not yet, but like the spring stirring around them. It was a promise of renewal. And for now, that was enough. The weeks passed in a rhythm of healing and hard work. Each morning found Ethan, Emma, and Ryan at the sanctuary. Their court-mandated community service transformed into something deeper than mere obligation. Under Maria's guidance, they learned the delicate art of wildlife rehabilitation, their hands growing steady with practice, their hearts opening to the work. Luna's physical wounds had mostly healed, leaving only faint scars beneath her thick fur. But it was the change in her demeanor that moved Mark the most. The fearful, desperate mother from the train tracks had given way to a calmer presence. She watched the teens with growing acceptance as they cleaned her enclosure and prepared enrichment activities for her cubs. "Look at this," Ethan called one morning, his phone recording, as Hope, the smallest cub, figured out the new puzzle feeder they designed. The little bear manipulated the wooden blocks with surprising dexterity, fishing out honey-covered berries while her siblings watched with interest. "She's getting smarter every day," Emma remarked, her once perfect manicure long replaced by practical short nails and calloused hands. She had spent hours researching bear cognition, turning her academic drive toward understanding the animals she once helped hurt. Ryan, working nearby, added fresh straw to the sleeping area. "Remember how scared they were, these feeders, at first?" His voice was lighter these days, unburdened by the secrets he'd carried. His aunt, the sheriff, had helped him enter addiction treatment program, and the clarity showed in his eyes. Mark observed from the barn office, pride warming his chest. The transformation in these young people was as remarkable as Luna's recovery. Their juvenile court judge had been impressed by their progress reports, particularly their initiative in developing educational programs about wildlife protection for local schools. "They're not the same kids who walked in here," Maria said, joining him at the window. "Neither are the bears." She nodded toward Luna, who was teaching her cubs to fish in the pond. Natural behaviors returning as their trust grew. The sanctuary itself had evolved, expanded by necessity to accommodate its new mission. Dr. Chun had become a regular donor, funding improvements that would help more injured wildlife. The sheriff's department now directed rescued animals their way, recognizing the unique combination of professional care and rehabilitation they provided. But it was the small moments that meant the most. Like now, as Mark watched Ethan sit near Luna's enclosure, sketching in a notebook he'd started keeping. His son had discovered a talent for wildlife art, his drawings capturing not just the animals' forms, but their essence, their spirit. "Dad," Ethan called softly, "come look at this." Mark approached, peering over his son's shoulder at the detailed drawing. It showed Luna with her cubs, but something in the way Ethan had captured her eyes made Mark catch his breath. There was strength there, and wisdom, and something that looked remarkably like forgiveness. "It's beautiful, son," Mark said, his voice rough with emotion. "I want to remember her like this," Ethan replied, not like he trailed off. But Mark understood, not like that morning on the tracks when cruelty had nearly won a commotion from the enclosure drew their attention. The cubs had discovered a new log filled with hidden treats. Another of Emma's enrichment projects, their playful wrestling brought a rare sound. Luna's rumbling pleasure, almost like a purr. "They're almost ready, aren't they?" Ethan asked quietly. Mark nodded. They'd all known this day was coming. Luna and her cubs had healed, grown stronger. The wild called to them more each day, their natural instincts surging back as the trauma receded. "The wildlife officials say another week," he confirmed. They found a good release site deep in the protected wilderness. The news spread quickly through the sanctuary that afternoon as the teens gathered for their daily tasks. There was a bittersweet energy in the air. They had known their time with Grace was temporary. That was the point of rehabilitation after all. But knowing didn't make it easier. "We should do something special." Emma suggested, her eyes bright with unshed tears, to say goodbye, but also to celebrate. Ryan, usually the quietest, spoke up. "What about a ceremony? Not just for Grace and the cubs, but for all of us to mark the change." The idea took root. They spent the next few days preparing, each bringing their own touch to the farewell. Ethan worked on a series of drawings documenting Luna's journey. Emma compiled their research and observations into a proper case study for future rehabilitators. Ryan, who had discovered a gift for carpentry, built a special feeding platform for the release site. Luna seemed to sense the shift in energy. She watched their preparations with those knowing eyes, her cubs growing more active, more wild with each passing day. The smallest one, Hope, still came to greet them, but there was a new independence in her movements. One evening, as the sun painted the sanctuary in gold, Mark found Ethan sitting alone by the enclosure. His son's face was thoughtful, peaceful in a way it hadn't been since Sarah's death. "Mom would have loved this place," Ethan said as Mark sat beside him. "She always said everything deserved a second chance." Mark wrapped an arm around his son's shoulders, feeling the lean strength that had replaced teenage awkwardness. "She was right, and she'd be so proud of you, Ethan, of who you're becoming." Luna approached the fence, her cubs trailing behind her. She studied them with that penetrating gaze, and Mark was struck again by the mystery of it all. How tragedy and grace had intertwined to bring healing not just to these bears, but to the broken places in all of them. "We're going to keep doing this, right?" Ethan asked, helping other animals, teaching people. Mark smiled, watching as Hope stood on her hind legs, sniffing the evening air. In her stance, he saw the wild creature she was meant to be. Just as in his son, he saw the man he was becoming. "Yes," he said simply, "this is just the beginning." The dawn mist clung to the Montana wilderness, transforming the forest into something mythical. A small convoy of vehicles wound their way up the mountain road. Mark's truck leading, followed by the wildlife transport trailer and several cars carrying the teens, their families, and sanctuary staff. Inside the trailer, Luna and her cubs waited calmly, as if they too understood the significance of this journey. Ethan sat beside his father, clutching the leather-bound portfolio of his bear drawings. The past week had been a whirlwind of preparation, each person contributing to this final chapter of Luna's story. Even the community had rallied around them, with local businesses donating supplies for other sanctuary projects after hearing about the transformation that had taken place. "Here," Mark said softly, pulling off onto a narrow Forest Service road. They had chosen this spot carefully, a remote valley deep in protected wilderness, far from human settlements, but rich with everything a bear family would need to thrive. The caravan came to a stop in a small clearing. Morning sunlight filtered through the towering pines, illuminating patches of early spring wildflowers. A mountain stream tumbled nearby, its clear waters teeming with fish. It was perfect. Ryan had arrived early that morning to set up the feeding platform he'd built, stocking it with fresh berries and fish, a final gift to ease the transition. Emma stood nearby, her research notebook opened as she made final observations. Their parents watched with quiet pride, seeing not the troubled teens who had made a terrible mistake, but the compassionate young adults they had become. Maria supervised as the wildlife team prepared to open the trailer. Everyone else moved back to a safe distance. This was the most delicate part of any release. Luna had to choose freedom on her own terms. "Ready?" Mark asked softly, looking at each of the teens in turn. They nodded, their faces solemn but peaceful. Ethan stepped forward, holding his portfolio. "I want to say something first," he said, his voice carrying in the mountain air, about second chances. The small gathering fell silent as Ethan opened his artwork. The first drawing showed Luna chained to the tracks, a moment of despair captured in careful detail. But each subsequent image told a story of healing. Luna with her cubs in the sanctuary, learning to trust again, growing stronger. "We almost destroyed something beautiful," Ethan continued, his voice steady. "But Luna taught us that healing is possible, that forgiveness isn't just given, it's earned through actions and choices, day by day." Emma wiped tears from her eyes as Ryan squeezed her shoulder supportively. Their own transformations were reflected in those drawings. The long hours of work, the gradual rebuilding of trust, the discovery of their better selves. The wildlife team signaled they were ready. Everyone held their breath as the trailer door opened slowly. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Luna appeared at the entrance, her powerful frame silhouetted against the darkness within. She paused, scenting the air, her cubs peering around her legs. "Go on," Ethan whispered. "You're free." As if hearing him, Luna stepped into the sunlight. Her fur gleamed healthy and thick, no trace remaining of the desperate creature they'd found that winter morning. Her cubs bounded after her. Their playful energy is sharp contrast to their mother's deliberate movements. Hope, the smallest cub, paused to look back at the humans. For a brief moment, her eyes met Ethan's. And in that connection was everything they couldn't say with words: gratitude, forgiveness, and the wild joy of being exactly what you were meant to be. Then she turned and followed her family into their new beginning. The group watched in reverent silence as Luna led her cubs toward the stream. She moved with confidence, already claiming this territory as her own. The cubs discovered Ryan's feeding platform, and their excited explorations brought smiles to every face. "Look," Emma whispered, making a final note in her journal. "She's teaching them to fish." Indeed, Luna had waded into the shallow water, showing her cubs how to catch the darting trout. It was a scene that should have happened naturally months ago, but watching it now made it no less magical. "I think," Dr. Chin said softly, "that this is what healing looks like." Sheriff Martinez nodded her arm around Ryan's shoulders. "For all of us." As the morning wore on, Luna and her cubs moved deeper into the valley, appearing and disappearing among the trees. The humans began their own preparations to leave, but no one rushed. They were witnessing something profound, not just a return of wild creatures to their home, but the restoration of something broken in themselves. Before they left, Ethan placed his portfolio drawings in a waterproof box they'd attached to Ryan's feeding platform. "For the next group," he explained, "so they'll know this story. Mark watched his son remembering the angry, grieving boy he'd been after Sarah's death. That pain wasn't gone, but it had been transformed. Just as a teen's guilt had been transformed into purpose, and Luna's fear into strength, ready to go, he asked as the last car started up. Ethan took a final look at the valley in the distance. They could just make out Luna's form as she crested a ridge, her cubs following close behind. She paused there, silhouetted against the sky, and let out a deep, rumbling sound. Not quite a growl, not quite a roar, but something in between. A farewell, perhaps, or a reminder that even in the darkest moments, light finds a way through. "Yeah," Ethan said, smiling. "But this isn't really goodbye, is it?" Mark shook his head, starting up the truck. The sanctuary awaited them, and with it, more animals in need of healing, more stories of redemption waiting to unfold. This story is sure to touch your heart and make you reflect on the strength of kindness and the importance of animal protection. If you've been moved by this story and want to explore more amazing tales, don't forget to hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on more inspiring and exciting videos. Thank you for watching this story, and we hope you'll continue with us on the journey to explore meaningful animal stories in the upcoming videos.